Essay prompt 3. When looking at acid and how the body deals with acid, it's first important to understand a couple of things. Namely, what is acid, or more precisely, what is an acidic environment? Secondly, what does an acidic environment do? Why do we care about balancing acid and dealing with it if it has no consequences? And thirdly, it's important to know how we produce acid. So the first thing, what is an acidic environment? An acidic environment is any area that has a low pH. Taking that a step further, we can say that a low pH is the same as having a high concentration of hydrogen molecules. Hydrogen molecules are what determines if something is acidic or basic. Like low hydrogen concentration, it's going to be basic, higher pH. If it has high concentration of hydrogen, lower pH, acidic. So then looking at what does an acidic environment do? The chief thing that it's going to do is going to cause proteins to break down, to denature. This is going to stop us from being able to engage in any kind of muscle contraction. Because if actin and myosin, our two muscle proteins, can't actually perform their job because they've been denatured, we can't ever form a cross bridge, ever engage in the power stroke. We are stuck and can't do anything. If the pH gets too low, even like into the 5 pH range, the body entirely dies. Everything shuts down and we just die. So it's very bad to be have the body to be acidic. This reaction can be seen commonly in how you cook meat. Particularly steak is a meat that is marinated quite often. Now, normally when you do this, you're going to use some kind of a citrus, lemon juice, lime juice. These are acidic things. Citrus juice is known to be acidic. So adding that in there is going to cause all of the proteins of the muscle to break down and to become more tender. It's the exact same thing that happens in your muscle when it gets too acidic. Now looking at how we create acid, or how we produce an acidic environment. We can produce it in 3 different ways. So the first way that we produce acid is through carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide comes from 2 places in the body. Mainly it comes from Krebs cycle, but it also comes from glycolysis. So at the end of glycolysis, the body has produced 2 pyruvates, which are those 3 carbon groups. But before pyruvate can enter into Krebs cycle, where we produce a lot more CO2, you have to break down pyruvate from a 3 carbon group to a 2 carbon group called acetyl-CoA. So when you remove that carbon, it has to go somewhere. That carbon ends up binding to oxygen. And then oxygen forms carbon dioxide with that carbon. So then on to Krebs cycle. Once acetyl-CoA comes in to the Krebs cycle, it is going to bind with a 4 carbon group called oxaloacetate. Those two together will form the citric acid molecule. The citric acid will remove 2 carbons throughout the entire rotation around. So it will produce 2 more carbon dioxides the exact same way that happened at the end of glycolysis. So if you're catching all the numbers here, you're producing 2 per rotation of the Krebs cycle. So that's 4 since you're running through it twice because you have 2 pyruvates, which the breakdown of pyruvate is also creating 1 total carbon dioxide. So you create 6 total carbon dioxides every time you run through glycolysis to Krebs cycle. So there's going to be this high concentration of carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide by itself is not acidic. It is acidic, however, when carbon dioxide binds to water and forms H2CO3. That is called carbonic acid. And just like the name implies, is going to function as an acid inside the body. The second way that the body produces acid is at the end of glycolysis. At the end of glycolysis, we have formed those 2 pyruvates. So pyruvate's fate we already discussed once, which was break down into lactate, or sorry, into acetyl CoA, which then goes into the Krebs cycle. Now, the body won't run through the Krebs cycle if we don't need to. The way we can tell if we need to or not is by looking at the concentration of NADH. If we have a high concentration of NADH, we have no reason to produce more through Krebs cycle. So instead of producing acetyl CoA, lactate or pyruvate will break down into lactate. And just like with carbon dioxide, lactate in and of itself is not directly acidic, but lactate will bind to a hydrogen and that will produce lactic acid. And that, just like the name implies with carbonic acid, is acidic. And the final way that we produce acid inside the body is through muscle contraction. All muscle contraction requires the use of ATP. ATP will break down or be broken apart or broken down from ATP from A to ADP, and adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate. When it does that, it not only releases energy, it also produces a hydrogen. That hydrogen is then going to increase the overall hydrogen concentration, which, just like we discussed earlier, will lower the pH. So what does what does the body do to combat this acid? The main way it deals with them is through what are called buffers. Now, buffers are very simply substances inside of the body that resist changes in pH. It resists a change in pH by either being able to accept or release a hydrogen ion. So, an example is if a molecule, or if there's a high concentration of hydrogens, your buffer needs to be able to deal with that somehow, which is it will pull hydrogens out of the environment and bind them to itself. What that's going to do is it's going to lower the overall concentration of hydrogen, thus increasing the pH, making it a little bit more basic, closer to neutral. Then the opposite is also true. In the event that an environment becomes too basic, it has too high of a pH, that's just as bad as if it has too low of a pH. So a buffer will start removing hydrogens out into the environment to bring that pH down back towards neutral. So the main version of this inside of the body is through what is called the bicarbonate buffer system, where bicarbonate, this molecule of HCO3, functions as a buffer. Now, HCO3 might sound a little bit familiar to carbonic acid being H2CO3. And it should sound pretty familiar because carbonic acid forms bicarbonate. The way this works is on a red blood cell, carbonic acid exists there. When it's ready to be like when it's ready to deal with that hydrogen, it will kick off one hydrogen from it. So H2CO3, carbonic acid, is going to remove a hydrogen. That hydrogen is then going to bind to a hemoglobin on a red blood cell. You are then going to be left with HCO3 bicarbonate. It can then perform the same action, remove another hydrogen if it needs to deal with like a basic environment. If it's still basic out there, it can still kick off a hydrogen to raise that or to lower that pH. Or it can accept another hydrogen and go back to carbonic acid, and then do the same process, remove it onto a red blood cell to bring the pH back down. Now, the way that we get rid of this is because, yeah, we've just bounded a hydrogen to hemoglobin. The issue with that is that we've just bound an acidic molecule of hydrogen to a protein in hemoglobin, which is going to cause it to denature and an inability to do its job. So we have to, at some point, remove that hydrogen. The way we do that is through breathing. So the blood is always going to make its way to the lungs at some point. It will come into the right side of the heart and then be pumped out into the pulmonary circuit. While in the alveoli of the lungs, through a one cell layer thick capillary around the alveoli, the red blood cell will take that hydrogen off of hemoglobin and will rebind it to bicarbonate. So going from HCO3 to H2CO3 back to carbonic acid. And then the process reverses from earlier. Carbonic acid breaks apart into its components of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And then from there, or sorry, not hydrogen, from H2O, water, and carbon dioxide into those two molecules. From there, the H2O will go back out into the blood, but the carbon dioxide will be exhaled. It will be exchanged with an oxygen molecule from breathing, which will then bind to hemoglobin, and then that carbon dioxide gets kicked out and then exhaled. And that's how we really deal with acid through breathing. Now, when we look at exercise and how that specifically affects everything, whenever we exercise, we have a much higher ATP demand for the body. We are going to increase the amount of ATP we need because we're going to be using more muscle fibers, thus producing a lot more acid. Running through Krebs cycle more often because we need to produce more NADH, more ATP as a whole. This is going to produce a lot of carbon dioxide. So one of the reasons why when we are in exercise, we start hyperventilating or breathing a lot more, it's because we're trying to remove a lot more of that CO2 and get a lot more oxygen in because we need oxygen to function for muscle contraction because it is needed for the overall action. Oxygen is very important in terms of muscle contraction and ATP production. That is how I would discuss acid base balance inside of the body, how we deal with it, and how exercise plays a role, as well as how ventilation deals with ATP or with that acid.